the napkin they made me sign 11 years ago was still sitting in my father-in-law's desk drawer, laminated now, almost ceremonial, like a trophy of a war he believed he'd already won. What he didn't know was that the real document, the one that actually mattered, was resting quietly under my own name, in a filing cabinet 3 states away, in the offices of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. My name is Naomi Reyes, and on the afternoon my marriage legally ended, I sat across a mahogany conference table from the man who once told me, on my wedding night, that some things simply need to be formalized before emotions get involved. I did not raise my voice. I did not remind him of the years I had spent quietly building the very empire he was now trying to take from me. I simply opened a manila folder, slid it across the table, and let the paper do what paper always does better than people. It told the truth, without apology, without warmth, and without room for negotiation. But to understand how I arrived at that table, calm, unshaken, while 3 grown adults slowly realized they had lost, you have to go back, 11 years earlier, to a wedding reception, a cocktail napkin, and a fountain pen. I married Julian Ashworth on a warm September evening, in a garden behind his family's estate, surrounded by white peonies and string lights his mother had imported from Italy. I was 26. I had just finished my master's degree in architecture, and I owned nothing but a modest apartment, a battered laptop, and a sketchbook full of half-finished dreams. Julian's family owned an architecture and development firm that had built half the skyline of our city. I was, by every metric his father used to measure people, a nobody. I remember the exact moment the evening changed. The band had just finished the first dance. Julian had gone to find his cufflinks, which he'd removed for the ceremony, and I was standing near the bar, still in my wedding dress, when his father, Bertram Ashworth, approached me with 2 glasses of champagne and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Naomi," he said, handing me a glass, "before this evening gets away from us, I need 5 minutes of your time, a formality, nothing more." He led me to a quiet table near the edge of the garden, away from the music, away from Julian. He pulled a cocktail napkin from beneath a candle holder and produced a fountain pen from his jacket, the kind of pen that costs more than my rent. "Our family has certain protective structures," he explained, his voice smooth and unhurried, as though he were discussing the weather. "Nothing personal, dear. Every spouse who marries into this family signs something similar. It simply states that any assets, holdings, or intellectual property belonging to the Ashworth family, before or during the marriage, remain solely and separately owned by the family. We wouldn't want any confusion down the road." I looked at the napkin. The handwriting was Bertram's own, hurried, slanted, informal. It was, on its face, almost laughable. A prenuptial agreement written on a cocktail napkin, on my wedding night, with no lawyer present, no witness, no notarization. "Shouldn't this go through an attorney?" I asked carefully. Bertram smiled the way men like him always smile when they expect no resistance. "Darling, it's simply a formality between family. We trust each other. This is just so that everyone understands their place, going forward." I looked toward the dance floor, where Julian was laughing with his groomsmen, entirely unaware that his father was quietly drawing a line between his new wife and everything the Ashworth name represented. I was 26, in love, exhausted from months of wedding planning, and desperate, in the particular, aching way young brides are desperate, not to start my marriage with conflict. So I signed it. I want to be honest about that moment, because too many people, when they tell stories like mine, pretend they were clever from the very beginning. I wasn't. I was tired and hopeful, and I told myself it didn't matter. It was a napkin. Napkins get thrown away. Bertram, however, did not throw it away. He folded it with the same careful precision he used when reviewing blueprints, slid it into his breast pocket, and patted my hand. "Good girl," he said. "Now go enjoy your evening." I would not understand the full weight of what I had signed for another 11 years. What Bertram Ashworth never accounted for, what men who measure people by their bank accounts rarely do, was who I would become. In the years that followed, I did not simply become Julian's wife. I became the architect behind 3 of the firm's most celebrated developments. I designed the modular rooftop garden system that became the signature feature of Ashworth residences downtown. I patented, under my own name, through my own private LLC, registered quietly, the year Julian and I bought our first home together, a proprietary structural framework for adaptive urban housing that the firm now used in nearly every major project. Julian knew about the patents. He simply never thought to ask who legally owned them. Bertram never asked either. He assumed, as men like him always assume, that anything built under his roof, funded by his name, belonged to his family by default. He kept his napkin laminated in his desk drawer as quiet insurance, a reminder to himself, more than to me, of exactly where I stood. He was wrong! And on the day Julian slid divorce papers across our kitchen island and told me, without meeting my eyes, that the family's assets are naturally staying with the family, I did not panic. I simply made one phone call to a patent attorney I had quietly retained 4 years earlier, and I asked her a single question. "Is it time?" She said yes. The years between that cocktail napkin and the divorce papers were not years of open cruelty. That was, perhaps, the most difficult thing to explain to people afterward, that the Ashworth family had never once raised their voices at me. They didn't need to. Contempt, I learned, does not require volume. It only requires consistency. It began quietly, the way most erosion does. At the firm's Christmas gala, 2 years into my marriage, Bertram introduced me to a group of investors as Julian's wife. She dabbles in design. I had, by then, already led the structural planning for 2 mid-rise developments. I said nothing. I smiled, shook hands, and reminded myself that correcting him in front of his guests would only be framed, later, as me making a scene. Julian's mother, Cordelia, had her own particular method. She never criticized me directly. Instead, she complimented me in ways that left small, precise bruises. "You have such a practical mind, Naomi," she told me once, at a family dinner, while gesturing toward Julian's sister, who had just been given a corner office and a title she'd never once earned through merit. Not everyone is built for the spotlight. Some of us are simply meant to support from behind. I remember setting down my fork very carefully that evening, the way you set down something you are afraid you might otherwise throw. Julian, to his credit, was not cruel in those years. He was something worse, in its own quiet way, absent. When his father dismissed my work in meetings, Julian would look at his hands. When his mother made her small surgical comments, Julian would change the subject, and later, in private, tell me I was reading too much into it. He loved me, I believe, in the only way his family had ever taught him love could exist, conditionally, and always in second place to the family name. It was in the 4th year of our marriage that I first understood, with total clarity, exactly what the napkin had been for. I had designed a modular rooftop garden system, an integrated water reclamation and green space framework that could be retrofitted onto existing high-rises without structural overhaul. It was, without exaggeration, the most innovative work I had ever produced. I brought the concept to Julian first, as I always did, sketches spread across our dining table, late into the night. He was genuinely excited. He brought it to his father the next morning. Bertram loved it immediately. Ashworth Residences downtown became the flagship project. The system became the firm's signature feature, plastered across brochures, press releases, and award submissions. My name appeared nowhere. When I gently raised the question of licensing or attribution, Bertram took me to lunch. A rare gesture, one I mistook, foolishly, for respect. "Naomi," he said, folding his hands over the white tablecloth, "you understand that everything produced under the Ashworth roof, by an Ashworth family member, belongs to Ashworth Development. That's simply how family businesses function. We protect what's ours." He smiled the same smile he'd worn 11 years earlier, over a cocktail napkin. "You signed something to that effect once, if I recall." I did recall. I recalled it exactly. I did not argue with him that day. I thanked him for lunch. I went home, and I sat for a long time in the quiet of my study, staring at the framed architecture license on my wall, the one with my name on it, and no one else's. That night, for the first time in 4 years, I opened the small fireproof box where I kept my most important documents. I did not take the napkin out. I didn't have it. Bertram had kept the original, laminated proudly in his desk drawer like a hunting trophy. But I did take out something else, a photograph I had quietly taken of it, years earlier, on the morning after my wedding, when I'd finally understood what I'd signed, and driven, alone, to Bertram's office before anyone else arrived, to see it again in the daylight and confirm it was real. I remember staring at that photograph that night, my husband asleep upstairs, and thinking not with anger, but with a strange, clarifying calm. If they intend to hold me to a document with no witness, no notary, and no legal standing, then I am not bound by their family's assumptions about what belongs to whom. I am bound only by what the law actually recognizes. The next morning, I made an appointment with an intellectual property attorney named Diane Whitfield, 3 counties away from any office the Ashworth family had ever set foot in. I told no one. Not my sister, not my closest friend, and certainly not Julian. I had learned by then that information shared inside that family did not stay contained. It traveled, was weaponized, and returned to you reshaped as evidence of your own instability. "Naomi's been talking to lawyers again," Cordelia would say, in that same soft, wounding voice. She's always been a bit dramatic about ownership, so I said nothing. I simply began, quietly and methodically, to build a structure of my own, one made not of napkins and assumptions, but of patents, private LLCs, and dates that could never be disputed. Diane's first question to me, in that small office with rain tapping against the window, was the only question that mattered. "Do you have anything at all, that proves this work originated with you, independent of the firm?" I opened my bag and placed my original sketchbooks on her desk, years of them, dated, initialed, some with coffee rings still staining the corners. I placed printouts of early emails to Julian, sent from my personal account, describing the rooftop system months before Bertram had ever heard the idea. I placed bank records showing the private LLC I had quietly registered the year Julian and I bought our first home, an LLC Bertram had never once asked about, because he had never imagined I was capable of building something entirely outside his reach. Diane looked through it all in silence. Then she looked up at me with an expression I would come to know very well over the following years. Not excitement, exactly, but the calm, professional satisfaction of a person who has just recognized a winning hand. "Mrs. Ashworth," she said, "I think it's time we filed." I did not smile. I simply nodded, and for the first time in 4 years of small, careful erosions, I felt something in my chest settle. Not triumph, not yet, but the quiet, steady foundation of a plan finally taking shape. Diane Whitfield's office became a place I visited the way other women visit a therapist, quietly, on manufactured lunch breaks, telling Julian I was meeting a client. In a sense, that wasn't even a lie. I was becoming my own client, piece by careful piece, in a case I hadn't yet told anyone I was building. The first thing Diane explained to me, in that measured, unhurried tone lawyers use when they already know they're going to win, was that the napkin itself was almost irrelevant. "Napkins don't hold up," she said, turning it over in her mind rather than her hands, since I'd never actually possessed the original. No notarization, no witness signature, no independent counsel advising you at the time of signing, and, most importantly, no consideration of what you were giving up in exchange. Courts don't enforce agreements like that. Bertram Ashworth has been protecting himself with theater, Naomi, not law. I remember sitting very still when she said that. 11 years of quiet deference, of biting my tongue at galas and dinners, of watching my name disappear from press releases. And the document that had justified all of it, in my own mind if nowhere else, was theater. But Diane was careful not to let me celebrate too early. "The napkin not holding up doesn't automatically mean you're protected," she warned. "It means Bertram can't use it against you. It doesn't mean you currently own anything. That's the part we need to build." So we built it. Over the following 18 months, working in the margins of a marriage that was slowly, silently coming apart, Diane and I constructed what she called an undeniable paper trail. We filed for formal utility patents on the modular rooftop garden system, not under Ashworth Development, but under Reyes Structural Innovations LLC, the private company I had quietly registered years earlier and never once mentioned to Julian's family. We dated everything meticulously. We cross-referenced my original sketchbooks, my early emails, my personal bank statements showing licensing consultations I'd paid for out of an account Bertram had never known existed. I did all of this without telling Julian. I want to be honest about how heavy that silence became. There were nights I sat across from him at dinner, watching him talk about his father's latest expansion plans built, unknowingly, on intellectual property that legally belonged to me, and I felt something close to grief. Not for the marriage exactly, for the version of Julian I had once believed might choose me over his family's assumptions, if it ever came down to a choice. It never did come down to a choice, not for him, only for me. The final piece of the strategy came from something Bertram himself had unknowingly handed me. 3 years into this quiet architecture of protection, the firm decided to pursue a licensing deal, selling the rights to my rooftop system to a competing development company in another state for a projected $2.3 million. Bertram announced it proudly at a family dinner, raising a glass of wine, thanking the Ashworth family's decades of innovation. I raised my glass along with everyone else. I smiled, and the next morning I had Diane send a formal cease and desist notice to the licensing company, informing them that the intellectual property in question was not in fact owned by Ashworth Development, and that any agreement made without the consent of the patent holder, Reyes Structural Innovations LLC, would constitute unauthorized use. The deal collapsed within a week. Bertram, as far as I know, spent months believing it had fallen apart due to cold feet on the buyer's side. He never once suspected the patent holder blocking his multi-million-dollar deal was sitting across from him at Thanksgiving dinner, quietly passing the cranberry sauce. It was around this time that Julian began to change, not toward me, but toward the marriage itself. He grew distant, distracted, prone to long silences over dinner. I later understood that his father had begun pressuring him, in private, about tightening the family's financial protections, a phrase I would come to recognize, months later, as code for divorce preparation. Bertram, it seemed, had started to sense that something in the family's carefully maintained hierarchy was shifting, even if he couldn't name what. He was not entirely wrong to be nervous. He was simply wrong about the direction the danger was coming from. The morning Julian finally told me he wanted a divorce, he did it the way his family did everything, efficiently, without cruelty, but also without warmth. He'd already had papers drawn up. His father's attorney had already reviewed them. The language was careful, clinical. All family-affiliated assets, holdings, and intellectual property developed during the marriage would remain the sole property of the Ashworth family trust. I read the document at our kitchen island in complete silence. Julian watched me, perhaps expecting tears, perhaps expecting an argument. I gave him neither. "I'll have my attorney review it," I said simply, and folded the papers with the same careful precision Bertram had once used on a cocktail napkin. That evening, I called Diane, not in panic, not in grief. I asked her only one question, the same one I would later ask again on the day of the settlement meeting. "Is it time?" There was a pause on the line, and then, in that calm, unhurried voice I had come to trust more than almost anyone else's in my life, she said, "It's been time for months, Naomi. I was waiting for you to be ready." I looked out the kitchen window at the garden Julian's mother had once called impractical when I'd designed it myself, 5 years earlier, entirely with my own hands and my own money. The peonies were blooming. I remember thinking, with a calm that surprised even me, that I was finally ready to let something I had spent a decade protecting, a marriage, a family name, a fragile idea of belonging, quietly, deliberately, go. "Yes!" I told her. "It's time!" There is a particular kind of fear that has nothing to do with danger and everything to do with timing. I learned this on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 11 months into building my case, when I came home early from a site visit and found Bertram Ashworth standing in my own kitchen, holding an envelope he had no right to be holding. He came by often in those years, uninvited, always with some small pretext, a document for Julian to sign, a bottle of wine just to check in. I had grown used to it, the way you grow used to a draft in an old house. You stop noticing the cold until, one day, it reaches somewhere it shouldn't. That afternoon, the mail had come early, and Bertram, waiting in the kitchen for Julian, who was running late, had done what men like him always do with things that aren't theirs. He had looked through it. I saw the envelope in his hand from the doorway, and for one full second, my heart did something I am not proud of. It stopped. The return address, printed in small, official type in the corner, read, United States Patent and Trademark Office. Addressed not to Julian, not to Ashworth Development, but to Reyes Structural Innovations, LLC, to me. "What's this?" Bertram asked, turning it over in his hands with the mild, distracted curiosity of a man who has never once had to wonder whether something belonged to him. "Reyes Innovations. Is this one of your little side projects, Naomi?" I want to tell you that I had rehearsed this moment, that somewhere in 11 months of quiet, methodical planning, Diane and I had scripted exactly what I would say if this day ever came. We hadn't. Some moments cannot be rehearsed. They can only be survived. "It's nothing," I said, and I am still, to this day, somewhat in awe of how steady my own voice sounded. "A consulting registration. I do some independent design work on the side. Nothing that concerns the firm." Bertram turned the envelope over once more, studying it the way he studied blueprints, carefully, but without any real understanding of what he was looking at. Patents, to a man like Bertram, were things his lawyers handled. Paperwork was beneath him, not because he was too important for it, but because he had never once needed to read anything closely. People had always handed him summaries. "You should be careful with side projects," he said, setting the envelope down on the counter with the light condescension of a man dispensing wisdom he assumes is welcome. Distractions like that can strain a marriage, Naomi. Julian needs a partner who's present, not one juggling little hobbies. I did not correct him. I did not tell him that the hobby sitting unopened on my kitchen counter represented $11 million of value his own firm had built its flagship development on. I simply nodded, the way I had nodded for 11 years, and said, "You're right. I'll keep it in perspective." He believed me completely. That, I think, was the moment I understood the full shape of the advantage I had been quietly building. Not just the patents, not just the paper trail, but the years and years of being underestimated so thoroughly that no one in that family had ever developed the habit of looking at me closely. He left 20 minutes later, forgetting the envelope entirely, distracted by a phone call about the downtown project. I stood alone in my kitchen for a long time after the door closed, holding an unopened letter from the United States Patent and Trademark Office, with my father-in-law's fingerprints still faintly visible on the paper. I called Diane that evening, my voice lower than usual, though there was no one left in the house to overhear me. "He held it," I told her. "He held the actual envelope. He almost opened it." There was a brief pause on the line, and then Diane's voice, steady as always. "But he didn't," she said simply. "Naomi, listen to me. Even if he had opened it, even if he had read every word, Bertram doesn't know what a provisional patent filing looks like. He wouldn't have understood what he was reading. Men like him only recognize threats that come wearing a suit and sitting across a conference table. They never suspect the woman refilling their coffee." I sat with that for a long moment after we hung up. It should have frightened me more than it did. How close the entire architecture of my quiet plan had come to collapsing over something as small as an unattended envelope on a kitchen counter. But instead, I felt something unexpected settle over me. Not relief exactly, certainty. Bertram Ashworth had spent his entire life reading rooms, reading deals, reading the subtle hierarchies of who mattered and who didn't. He was, by every account, a genuinely skilled businessman, but he had never once in 11 years thought to read me. And that blindness, that specific, arrogant blindness, was the only vulnerability I had ever needed. I moved the remaining correspondence to a private post office box the following week, 40 minutes from the house, under a name that meant nothing to anyone in that family. I told no one, not even Diane, exactly where it was. I simply drove there quietly, once every 10 days, on my way to appointments no one thought to question, and collected the slow, steady proof of everything I was building. I never came that close again. But I have never forgotten standing in my own kitchen, watching a man who believed he owned everything in his orbit hold the one document that would eventually end that belief entirely, and set it down, unopened, because he had never once imagined I was capable of holding something he couldn't see. The settlement meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in a conference room on the 14th floor of Whitfield and Associates, Diane's office, not the Ashworth family's usual glass tower downtown. That detail alone, I would later learn, unsettled Bertram more than he let on. He was used to negotiating on his own territory, surrounded by his own portraits, his own leather chairs, his own carefully curated sense of permanence. I arrived 20 minutes early. I wore a simple charcoal suit, no jewelry except my grandmother's small gold watch, and I sat at the far end of the mahogany table with a folder closed in front of me, my hands folded over it the way you might fold your hands over something you intend to protect, rather than reveal. Julian arrived first, alone, his eyes tired in a way I hadn't seen since the early years of our marriage, before his father's expectations had hardened into something permanent between us. He didn't look at the folder. He looked, briefly, almost apologetically, at me, and then away, as though even that small act of humanity might be reported back to his father as weakness. Bertram arrived 7 minutes later, trailing his own attorney, a sharp, silver-haired man named Mr. Cole, who carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who has never once lost. Cordelia did not come. She rarely appeared for anything that might require her to witness consequences rather than simply narrate them afterward. Bertram sat down across from me, without so much as a greeting. "Let's not draw this out," he said, sliding a thick document across the table with the same brisk efficiency he'd once used on a cocktail napkin. "The terms are generous, Naomi. The condo stays with Julian, obviously, given the family's investment in it. All firm-affiliated projects, designs, and intellectual property developed during the marriage remain the sole property of Ashworth Development, per the agreement made at the time of your marriage." He said it so plainly, so certainly, that for a moment I understood, truly understood, in a way I hadn't allowed myself to before, that he had spent 11 years believing that Napkin was a fortress, not a formality, a fortress. I did not touch his document. "Before we discuss your terms," I said, my voice even, unhurried, "I'd like to clarify something for the record. Mr. Cole, are you aware of the exact legal status of the document Mr. Ashworth is referencing? The one signed at my wedding reception." Mr. Cole glanced at Bertram, faint uncertainty crossing his face for the first time. "I understand there was a premarital agreement of some kind. There was a cocktail napkin," I said, "handwritten, unsigned by any witness, never notarized, presented to me without independent counsel on the night of my own wedding by my father-in-law while my husband was across the garden retrieving his cufflinks." I opened my folder and slid a single photograph across the table, the photograph I had taken that morning after my wedding of the napkin resting on Bertram's desk, time-stamped, dated, entirely unambiguous. "I'd be happy to let you review its enforceability with your own counsel, Mr. Cole. I suspect you'll reach the same conclusion mine did 18 months ago." The room went very quiet. Bertram's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign, in over a decade of knowing him, that I had ever seen him genuinely rattled. "That document represents an understanding," he said, his voice cooler now, regardless of its form. "Understandings aren't enforceable, Bertram," Diane said calmly, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. "Contracts are. And speaking of contracts," she nodded toward me, "Naomi, would you like to continue?" I opened the second folder. "The modular rooftop garden system currently installed across 4 Ashworth Residences properties," I said, "including the flagship downtown development that has generated, by the firm's own press materials, over $11 million in additional property valuation and licensing interest, was designed, sketched, and technically developed by me, independently, prior to any involvement from Ashworth Development. It is patented under Reyes Structural Innovations LLC, a company I registered privately 6 years ago. I am the sole owner." I slid the patent documentation across the table, dated, certified, indisputable. Bertram did not reach for it immediately. He simply stared at it the way a man stares at a structural crack in a building he'd always assumed was sound, with the particular, dawning horror of someone recalculating everything he thought he understood about his own foundation. "This is absurd," he said finally, though his voice had lost its earlier command. "The firm has been using that system for years. It's in every piece of our marketing. You never once objected." "I never objected publicly," I said, "because I was quietly building a legal record instead of a confrontation. There's a difference, Bertram, between silence and consent. I chose the former. I never gave the latter." Mr. Cole had gone very still, flipping through the patent filings with the particular focus of a man doing rapid, unhappy arithmetic in his head. Mr. Ashworth, he said quietly, not quite meeting Bertram's eyes. I'm going to need a moment to speak with you privately. There's no need, I said, before Bertram could respond. I'm not here to bankrupt the firm or to punish Julian for choices that were largely made for him before he was old enough to question them. I'm here to formally notify Ashworth Development that continued use of my patented system without a licensing agreement constitutes ongoing infringement, and that I expect fair compensation, retroactive to the date of first use, going forward. I paused, letting the number settle into the room before I said it aloud. Diane's initial calculation, based on comparable licensing rates in the industry, places retroactive damages and future licensing fees in the range of $4.6 million. I'm willing to discuss a structured settlement. I am not willing to sign away rights to work I built with my own hands, on my own time, using my own resources, work that was never, at any point, legally the property of this family. Bertram's face had gone the particular shade of gray I imagine only appears when a man realizes, in real time, that the leverage he has spent a decade assuming he held was never real at all. Julian, beside him, had not spoken a single word since the meeting began. I watched him now, watched something shift behind his eyes. Not anger exactly, but a slow, painful recognition. He looked at his father, then he looked at me. You knew about this, he said quietly. For how long? Long enough to build it properly, I said, and I did not look away from him when I said it. Long enough to make sure that when this moment came, no one in this room could accuse me of acting rashly, or emotionally, or without cause. I learned that from your family, Julian. I learned it from watching how carefully you all protected what you believed was yours. Bertram finally reached for the folder. His hands, I noticed, with a strange, quiet detachment, no longer entirely steady. We'll need time to review this, Mr. Cole said, gathering the documents with visibly more caution than he'd shown when he'd first walked in. Take all the time you need, I said, closing my own folder and rising from the table. I've had 11 years. I can afford to be patient a little longer. I did not slam the door on my way out. I did not raise my voice, or cry, or allow myself even the small human satisfaction of looking back to see Bertram Ashworth's face as he finally understood, in full, exactly what he had signed away the moment he decided a cocktail napkin could stand in for the law. I simply walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and waited, calm, steady, and for the first time in over a decade, entirely, unmistakably, my own. The settlement was finalized 4 months later, though finalized felt like too small a word for what actually happened in that time. Bertram's attorneys, once they'd fully reviewed the patent filings, understood almost immediately that there was no path to victory, only a negotiation over how graceful the loss would be. The firm agreed to a structured settlement, $2.8 million in retroactive licensing fees, paid over 18 months, along with a formal, ongoing royalty agreement for continued use of the rooftop system. I kept the divorce simple. I did not ask for the condo, or alimony, or anything from the Ashworth name that I hadn't built myself. I only asked for what had always, legally, already been mine. I moved into a small house on the edge of the city that autumn. Nothing grand, nothing that needed to announce itself. It had a garden I designed myself, without anyone calling it impractical, and a study with a window that caught the morning light exactly where I wanted my drafting table to sit. I saw Julian only once more, by accident, at a hardware store the following spring. He looked older, somehow, though barely a year had passed. He asked, quietly, if I hated his father. I told him the truth. I didn't. Hatred requires a kind of ongoing attention I no longer had any interest in giving that family. What I felt, if anything, was closer to a distant, clinical relief, the way you feel when a structural inspection finally confirms that a building you'd long suspected was unsound is, in fact, unsound, and you are no longer required to live inside it. He asked if I was happy. I told him I was something better than happy. I was finally, entirely, unmistakably accounted for. My name on my own patents, my own deed, my own work, with no one left to quietly claim it as theirs. He didn't have a response to that. I don't think there was one to give. Looking back now, from the quiet of my own study, with my own name on the license framed above my desk, I understand the 11 years I spent inside that family, not as wasted time, but as an extended, difficult education, one I would never have chosen, but one that taught me, more thoroughly than any classroom ever could, exactly what it means to protect what is yours before someone else convinces you it never was. Lessons from this story. Lesson 1. Silence is not the same as consent, but it must eventually be converted into proof. For years, I believed that staying calm, staying quiet, and simply enduring was itself a form of strength. It is, but only if that silence is doing something. Real protection isn't just holding your tongue while someone erodes what's yours. It's using that same quiet time to document, to date, to register, to build a record no one can later dispute. Grace without evidence is simply a slower kind of surrender. Lesson 2. The people who ask you to sign away your future casually are almost always the ones who understand its value most clearly. Bertram didn't hand me that napkin because he thought it was worthless. He handed it to me precisely because he suspected, even then, what I might one day become. Pay close attention to what people try to take from you quickly, informally, and without proper witness. The haste itself is information. Lesson 3. Being underestimated is not an insult. It is, if you let it be, a strategic advantage. For over a decade, I was introduced as someone who dabbles, someone practical, someone built to support from behind. Every one of those dismissals bought me time and cover to build something they never once thought to look for. The people who assume you are harmless rarely think to check what you're quietly constructing in the rooms they've decided don't matter. Lesson 4. A family that only respects contracts and never relationships will eventually be met on exactly those terms. I did not want my marriage to end in a conference room over patent filings and licensing fees. I wanted, once, for it to simply be a marriage, built on trust rather than protective clauses. But when a family chooses, from the very first night, to treat love as something requiring legal fortification, they forfeit the right to be surprised when the person they underestimated eventually shows up not with forgiveness, but with documentation. I still keep one thing from that first year of marriage. Not the napkin, which I never had, but the photograph I took of it, the morning after my wedding, standing alone, in an empty parking lot, outside Bertram's office, unsure, at the time, of what I was even preparing for. I framed it, eventually. Not out of bitterness, but as a reminder, on the days when I'm tempted to make myself smaller for the sake of someone else's comfort, of exactly what quiet, patient, well-documented resolve is capable of building, piece by piece, folder by folder, until the day it is finally, unmistakably, undeniably yours.